Welcome back once again to another AP World History video lecture, and this time we are on National Review Unit number 3. Good news, guys, we are marching through these units and we are covering a lot of good material to get you ready for the AP test. So what is Unit 3 all about? You know, one of the big things we want to focus on as we look at each one of these units in review are those inspect categories. And each one of them is really centered around one or two of the big themes. And Unit 3 is really clear. Unit 3 is all about politics. So on inspect categories, we're looking at that political, and we're really looking at governmental management. And it has to do with how large what are called land-based empires governed minorities. Okay, so why is that so important? So there's this common story, or what we call narrative, about why empires arose. So we go back in world history to the beginnings. Human beings were a part of hunter-gatherer societies, right? So what was their big problem? Well, hunter-gatherers needed food, so they were looking around for food, and eventually they settled down and created massive amounts of food. Okay, cool, that solves a problem, you got your food, right? But that creates a new problem. As you have more food, you grow a bigger population. So how do you feed the population? You got to grow more food. Except the more food you grow, the more change you make to your local environment. And whether it's due to climatic changes or changes humans made to their environment, eventually their population outpaced that of food and would then face problems like famine or death. So how do you solve that problem? Well, it seems like humans came up with a way to do that. They created empires. Empires allowed them to have these large governmental systems that could grow food, record food, and disperse them to people. Plus, they created a lot of labor systems, not all good ones by any means. In many cases, it was slave or forced labor, but it did create the ability to have large amounts of food for a growing population. Okay, cool, we solved a problem, right? Food and population. But empires create a whole new problem. In order to do what they were doing, they had to go out and conquer areas. And the bigger they got, the more populations they controlled. So that means, how do you manage these large populations, especially what we call minorities? Now, when you think of minority today, my guess is you're thinking of like racial minorities, gender minorities, maybe sexual orientation, because we live in a post-civil rights society. But that's not the minorities that I'm talking about. The minorities of previous time periods are religious minorities, language minorities, or cultural minorities. Okay, so here's my thesis. Yes, always have a thesis because that's important regardless of what you're doing. Here's my thesis. The most successful empires found a way to respect local cultures while maintaining their centralized government and their common culture. Okay. So let's start off first off with these large land-based empires. Large land-based empires at this time period were known as gunpowder empires. You might remember, so we have the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. Okay, so these large land-based empires, they got their gunpowder from China, and eventually guns were then created, and we think kind of like in the Indian empires, okay? So like we said, these large land-based empires spread out, and they were used to deal with the problem of resources. And we have our three: the Ottomans, which went from about the border of what today would be Iraq out to northern Africa. The Safavids, which were located in Iraq, their capital city actually was Baghdad. And the Mughals, which were up in the northern India area. So our big challenges were going to be those internal issues of managing minorities, but also for the Muslims, the fight between the Sunni and the Shia. A group called the Sufis would be important, and for India, just being a large land-based empire in India is really going to be a big issue. Okay, number 2, their management system. So how do they manage this stuff? How did they keep these minorities operating within their empires? Okay, let's start off with the Ottomans. You might remember they have the largest area. Okay, they cover from that border of Iraq all the way up to northern Africa. They're on the Mediterranean. Okay, so they have a strong navy, and they also have a huge connection to trade, both the Indian Ocean, and they're going to have a connection to the Silk Road. So how did they govern these minorities? Number 1, very important, they established millets. Millets were those local areas where a Christian community led their Christian community, Jewish community or Jewish community, Islamic community their Islamic community. Remember why that becomes so important? Remember what happens to the Armenians eventually? They have their own millet, right? And they're doing fine up until World War I. There was also something called the Dev-Shirmi process. Okay, what was the Dev-Shirmi process? Basically, it's kidnapping when it comes down to it. But the Ottomans would go out and they would take young boys or young women from each one of these communities, and they put them into either the Janissary Corps, that was the military advisory for the Ottomans, the harem, okay, that's where women would go, and their job was to reproduce the next harem. So why did they do all of this? Okay, remember what I talked about with this. The idea was to co-opt. What does that mean? So remember how important blood is at this time period. It's not important to us today, but it was back then. If you come from a particular community, your blood is in that community. Nobody should violate you. So if you're a Christian, it doesn't matter if you converted to Islam. You come from the Christian community, right? So if there are these boys who are up in the Janissary Corps that come from local Christian communities, Jewish communities, Islamic communities, they were forced to convert to Islam. They grew up in Islam, but they initially came from those communities. So we're not going to raise a rebellion against the Janissary Corps because the people in there are part of our community. Same with the harem. We're not going to rebel against the harem because the women in the harem come from our community. And we don't know, reproduction-wise, which one of the boys from the harem becomes a sultan. It could be somebody from a Christian background, from a Jewish background. Now, they're all Muslim. They've all converted to Islam, but they come from our communities. Okay, so that was the idea. Co-opt people into the system. Okay, next up, the Safavids. So the key figure in the Safavids is a man named Shah Abbas. Shah Abbas, Safavids are very small. They're located in Iraq. They're fighting primarily with the Ottomans. They are Shiite. And what Shah Abbas did was he centralized the Safavids under one faith, the Shia faith. He also brought in outside Persian advisors. Why is that important? Because it created competition. These Persian advisors competed with the local nobles within the Safavid Empire, and that way nobody was able to gain too much power in the Safavids. Now, there is one problem here, and it's the Sufi community. The Sufi is the third sect of Islam. They are what we know as a mystical group. What does that mean? Their approach to Islam was not by the Quran. Now, they believed in the Quran, but their approach to God was much more through emotion and intuition. They tended to be like the non-violent foot soldiers of Islam. What do I mean by that? They would go from place to place and relate to people based on their emotions and experience. They spread Islam much more than anybody else did. The problem is the Sufis don't agree with the Shia and everything. Shia don't agree with the Sufis. So Shah Abbas tended to oppress the Sufis. We've got to remember that. Last off, the Mughals. So the Mughals were located up in northern India. That area was conquered by Babur. Okay, he came in and established the Mughals. One of his relatives, Akbar the Great, eventually establishes what's called the Divine Faith. The Divine Faith was an attempt to mix all the faiths together. Hindu, Islam, Christian, find their common beliefs and create one faith. Akbar the Great was known to have gotten rid of the jizya tax. Akbar the Great allowed for intermarriage of Hindus and Muslims. Akbar the Great allowed for Hindus to have their temples open, and he established the zamindar system. These were local governors who would organize people, collect taxes, but they would really rule from the local area. That worked out pretty well until the grandson of Akbar the Great, that guy named Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb said, we got to get rid of all this. Remember, I'm pure Islamic. That's being undermined. Aurangzeb turned everything back. He put the jizya tax into place, didn't allow for intermarriage, kicked the Hindus out of the courts, and then he started up a war with the Marathas down in the south, trying to take them over. Okay, some other empires that kind of don't fit into what we've seen so far, but they're important. The Aztecs, please remember them. They are a highly centralized empire. They had 2 million people in the middle of the Mexican desert. How do they do this? Well, they had the Chinampas, which allowed them to gather water and build those hanging gardens. They had a highly structured hierarchical system based upon the religion of the sun, the belief that the sun god took care of them, and because of that, they then needed human sacrifice, which was the tribute system. So when they conquered people, they demanded both crops and human beings for sacrifice to that sun god. The other big one I want you to remember is the Japanese. Now, the Japanese really don't fit into what we've talked about before. So far, what we've seen are centralization of empires. The Japanese were kind of on the other end. The Japanese had a fragmented or decentralized empire in which local daimyo or governors tended to rule. Now, there was a centralized military. The samurai, who were sort of these, they traveled from place to place and they would get hired by local daimyo. But there was a shogunate. There was a centralized military authority. But the problem in Japan was there was just never an ability to really organize the island together. And that's going to be important because that centralization does happen, but it happens in the 1800s when America forces Japan open to trade. Which leads us into the other big exception that we need to remember at this time period, at the end of this time period, okay, in about 1600, which is the Protestant Reformation. So in 1600s, Martin Luther challenges the Catholic Church and says, this whole idea of like priests or clerics who are in control, we got to get rid of that, right? Let the individuals go to the Bible and make their own decisions. John Calvin says, we don't get to choose anyways who gets saved. God chooses. We call that the elect. God's going to choose who's saved, who's not. This allows for local princes in Europe to separate from the Catholic Church and to claim that they want their own kingdoms, their own regions, their own empires. In other words, decentralization. Now, this is really important for where we're leading to, because Europe decentralizes. You would think they're not going to be successful. They are. Why? Because they start competing with each other. Okay, so what are our big takeaways? Number one, the empire centralized in order to solve that food and population problem. Okay, and that was the big solution at that time period. Number two, but these empires also allowed for local sovereignty, and that allowed to co-opt people into the system. And that solved for both the problems of food, the problems of population, and it solved for the problems of getting people to buy into this. But number three, the exceptions of Japan and the Protestant Reformation shows that decentralization would be successful after this time period, when we get into industrialization and imperialism. Okay, see you guys in class.